Multiple U.S. officials voiced frustration this past week with Canadian provinces that refused to sell American liquor as part of the response to the U.S. president's tariff.
It's been 1 year since American-made alcohol products were pulled from LCBO shelves and taken off the menus at restaurants and bars across Ontario. It's been an enormous hit to U.S. producers.
This is an enormous hit to the American producers. Every year, the LCBO sells nearly $1 billion worth of U.S. wine, beer, cider, seltzers, and spirit.
A year ago, Donald Trump was saying Canada needed America more than America needed Canada. Now, American whiskey exports are at a 10-year low. Jim Beam shut down bourbon production at its biggest distillery for all of 2026. And Washington is openly threatening Canada because millions of Canadians simply stopped buying American alcohol. At the exact same time, Canada is quietly preparing a pipeline that could redirect another 1 million barrels of oil per day away from the United States and toward Asia, cutting directly into one of America's biggest long-term economic advantages. What started as a trade fight is suddenly turning into something much bigger, because the country Trump once mocked as dependent is now using consumer pressure, energy leverage, and global demand to hit back in ways Washington clearly did not expect. What makes this story so unusual is that the pressure is coming from two completely different directions at once, and both are damaging American industries that once believed Canada would always remain tied to them no matter what happened politically. The first shock came from Canadian consumers, who began boycotting American wine and spirits after months of escalating trade threats, tariff battles, and repeated comments from Trump suggesting Canada had no real leverage over the United States. The second shock came from the energy sector, where Canada is now actively exploring a future that relies far less on American refineries and far more on Asian buyers willing to pay global market prices for Canadian crude. Together, those two developments are creating a situation that many economists in both countries never thought they would see, where the United States is suddenly losing influence over its closest ally at the exact moment it is trying to pressure it harder. The alcohol numbers alone are staggering. According to the Wine Institute, American wine exports to Canada collapsed by 78% in 2025, falling from roughly $460 million to just $103 million in a single year. That one decline of $357 million accounted for 81% of all global losses in U.S. wine exports, which shows just how important Canada had become to American producers over the last decade. Canada had represented 36% of total American wine exports in 2024, making it by far the industry's biggest foreign market. But by 2025, that share had crashed to just 12%, leaving vineyards in California, Oregon, Washington State, and New York scrambling to replace customers they once assumed would always be there. Members of Congress from wine-producing regions started sounding the alarm almost immediately because wineries were suddenly reporting canceled contracts, unsold inventory, and severe revenue losses that stretched far beyond just a temporary political dispute. The collapse in spirits was even worse. U.S. spirits exports to Canada dropped 85% during the second quarter of 2025, falling below $10 million, and some of America's most recognizable alcohol brands suddenly found themselves losing one of their largest international markets almost overnight. Brown-Forman, the company behind Jack Daniel's and Woodford Reserve, revealed that its Canadian sales plunged 62% during the first half of its 2026 fiscal year, and CEO Lawson Whiting openly admitted the boycott was worse than a tariff, because tariffs can at least be negotiated, while consumer anger is much harder to reverse. Then came the announcement that shocked the bourbon industry most. Jim Beam said it would suspend bourbon production throughout 2026 at its major distillery in Claremont, Kentucky, citing weakening demand, tied partly to the Canadian boycott and broader export declines. For an industry built on growth projections and expanding international demand, hearing that one of Kentucky's biggest bourbon facilities would effectively go quiet for an entire year sent a message far beyond the alcohol business itself. And this is where the political side became even more dramatic. During testimony before Congress, U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer was asked directly about Canada's boycott of American wine and spirits. His response instantly made headlines because he placed Canada in the same category as China, saying there were two countries retaliating economically against the United States in the past year: the People's Republic of China and Canada, before warning that Washington might need an enforcement action to deal with the issue. Think about how extraordinary that sounded for a moment. Canada is America's closest ally, largest trading partner, NATO partner, intelligence partner, and next-door neighbor, yet officials in Washington were suddenly discussing it in the same breath as Beijing because Canadian consumers stopped buying bourbon and California wine. The pressure inside Washington became obvious very quickly because lawmakers from both parties began hearing directly from industries being hurt by the boycott. U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick added fuel to the fire during a Senate hearing when he declared, "It is outrageous that Canada will not put U.S. spirits on the shelf. It is insulting and disrespectful to America." But that statement also revealed the deeper problem facing Washington, because the federal government in Ottawa does not fully control this boycott in the first place. Alcohol distribution in Canada is heavily regulated by provincial governments, meaning provinces like Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia decide what products appear on liquor store shelves. And those provincial leaders are responding to public anger that remains extremely strong. Ontario Premier Doug Ford made that crystal clear when he was asked whether American wine and spirits could return to shelves soon. Ford said he would restore them in a heartbeat, but only after broader trade disputes with Washington were resolved, adding that Ontario could not change course while the United States continued threatening Canadian industries, particularly the auto sector, which supports tens of thousands of jobs across the province. His comments reflected a political reality spreading across Canada, where even leaders who traditionally preferred close economic cooperation with the United States are now facing enormous pressure from voters who believe Canada needs to become less dependent on its southern neighbor. A Nanos research poll found that 73% of Canadians supported keeping the boycott in place, while only 20% wanted American alcohol products returned to shelves. Those are not narrow numbers driven by a fringe movement. That is a national shift in consumer sentiment. What really shocked American officials was how quickly the movement spread culturally across Canada. The Elbows Up campaign, inspired by hockey legend Gordie Howe's famous defensive move, turned into a nationwide symbol of economic resistance. More than 1.4 million Canadians joined online groups focused on buying domestic products, while apps designed to identify American-made goods surged in downloads as consumers actively searched for alternatives. Grocery stores highlighted Canadian brands, restaurants promoted locally sourced products. Even small towns began organizing campaigns, encouraging residents to avoid American goods whenever possible. That matters because consumer movements are incredibly difficult to fight politically. Governments can negotiate tariffs, amend trade agreements, or remove regulations, but they cannot easily force millions of angry people to start buying products they no longer want. That is why the boycott has become such a frustrating issue for Washington, because there is no single law to overturn and no simple negotiation that instantly restores demand. And while American officials were focused on collapsing bourbon exports and angry wine producers, another far larger story started unfolding behind the scenes in the energy sector. Bloomberg reported that Alberta is now evaluating 3 potential routes for a new oil pipeline capable of carrying 1 million barrels per day through northern British Columbia to the Pacific coast, where that oil could then be exported directly to China, South Korea, and other Asian markets. That number is enormous on its own, but it becomes even more significant when combined with the Trans Mountain expansion, which already added roughly 890,000 barrels per day of export capacity to Canada's Pacific Coast infrastructure. Together, those projects would fundamentally change how Canadian oil reaches global markets and reduce America's privileged access to discounted Canadian crude that U.S. refineries have benefited from for decades. For years, the United States enjoyed a massive structural advantage because Canada had very few alternatives for exporting oil. Around 90% of Canadian crude exports still flow into the American market, especially toward Gulf Coast refineries built specifically to process heavy crude. Because Canada lacked major Pacific export routes, American buyers were able to purchase Canadian oil at steep discounts compared to global benchmark prices. The gap between Western Canadian Select and West Texas Intermediate crude historically averaged between $14 and $18 per barrel, saving American refiners billions of dollars over time. That discount existed largely because Canada had limited bargaining power. If your only customer is next door, that customer effectively controls pricing leverage. But the Trans Mountain expansion started changing that equation almost immediately after its completion in 2024. Oil exports to Asia surged, particularly shipments to China moving through Vancouver. Earlier this year, Canada exported more seaborne crude to China than to the United States for the first time ever, something that would have sounded almost impossible just a few years ago. Now, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is pushing aggressively for a second major Pacific route, with Prince Rupert emerging as one of the leading options because it offers the shortest shipping route from North America to Shanghai, even shorter than Vancouver or major American West Coast ports. Alberta has already committed millions toward early-stage planning and hopes to submit formal proposals to Prime Minister Mark Carney's Major Projects Office by July 1st, in an effort to secure accelerated approval status. Prime Minister Mark Carney has leaned heavily into that argument, framing Canada as an emerging energy superpower capable of commanding global demand instead of accepting economic dependence on the United States. When asked recently about negotiations with Washington ahead of the USMCA review, Carney pushed back firmly against the idea that Canada would simply accept American demands, saying trade talks are not a situation where someone is making demands and a supplicant. That language matters because it reflects a broader psychological shift happening inside Canada's political leadership. For decades, Canadian governments often approach trade disputes cautiously out of fear that economic retaliation from Washington could severely damage Canada's economy. Today, leaders in Ottawa and several provinces increasingly believe diversification itself is the answer, whether through Europe, Asia, or new domestic manufacturing strategies. And that is ultimately why these two stories connect so powerfully. The alcohol boycott is not just about bourbon or California wine, and the pipeline discussion is not just about oil exports. Both are symptoms of the same larger transformation taking place across North America, where Canada is actively trying to reduce the leverage the United States has traditionally held over its economy. American industries are now experiencing what that shift actually looks like in practice. From whiskey producers watching exports collapse to Gulf Coast refineries, realizing their cheapest crude supply may no longer remain guaranteed forever. Meanwhile, Washington's threats appear to be generating even more resistance rather than compliance, because every new warning from American officials reinforces the argument inside Canada that relying too heavily on a single partner leaves the country vulnerable politically and economically. What makes this moment historically significant is that none of this happened because of a military conflict or a financial crash. It started with political rhetoric, consumer anger, tariffs, and trade pressure, then evolved into something much larger involving national identity, energy strategy, and long-term economic independence. The United States still has enormous economic power, and Canada remains deeply tied to the American market in countless ways, but the assumption that Canada will always have no choice except to follow Washington's lead suddenly looks far weaker than it did just a few years ago. If Canada successfully builds another Pacific pipeline carrying 1 million barrels per day, while American alcohol brands continue losing market share across Canadian shelves, historians may eventually look back on this period as the moment the entire economic relationship between the two countries quietly began changing direction. And the question now is no longer whether this trade fight caused damage, because the numbers already answered that. The real question is whether the relationship between these two countries can fully return to what it once was after consumers, companies, and governments on both sides started preparing for a future where dependence on each other is no longer guaranteed. Do you think Canada is making the right move by diversifying away from the United States? Or do you believe both countries are risking long-term damage by escalating this economic standoff further? Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe and stay tuned, because the next phase of this story could reshape North American trade and energy politics for decades.